Hegel's Philosophy of Mind, Part 1, The Subjective Mind, Subsection B, Phenomenology of Mind, Consciousness, Encyclopedia section 413. Consciousness constitutes the reflected or correlational grade of mind, the grade of mind as appearance. Ego is infinite self-relation of mind, but as subjective or as self-certainty. The immediate identity of the natural soul has been raised to this pure ideal self-identity, and what the former contained is for this self-subsistent reflection set forth as an object. The pure abstract freedom of mind lets go from its specific qualities, the soul's natural life, to an equal freedom as an independent object. It is of this latter, as external to it, that the ego is in the first instance aware, conscious, and as such it is consciousness. Ego, as this absolute negativity, is implicitly the identity in the otherness. The ego is itself that other and stretches over the object as if that object were implicitly cancelled. It is one side of the relationship and the whole relationship, the light which manifests itself in something else too. Encyclopedia section 414. The self-identity of the mind, thus first made explicit as the ego, is only its abstract formal identity. As soul, it was under the phrase of substantial universality. Now, as subjective reflection in itself, it is referred to this substantiality as to its negative, something dark and beyond it. Hence, consciousness, like reciprocal dependence in general, is the contradiction between the independence of the two sides and their identity in which they are merged into one. The mind as ego is essence, but sense reality in the sphere of essence is represented as in immediate being, and at the same time as ideal, it is as consciousness only the appearance phenomenon of mind. The mind as ego is essence, but sense reality in the sphere of essence is represented as in immediate being, and at the same time as ideal, it is as consciousness only the appearance phenomenon of mind. Encyclopedia section 415. As the ego is by itself only a formal identity, the dialectical movement of its intelligible unity, in essence, the successive steps in further specification of consciousness, does not to it seem to be its own activity, but is implicit, and to the ego it seems an alteration of the object. Consciousness consequently appears differently, modified according to the difference of the given object, and the gradual specification of consciousness appears as a variation in the characteristics of its objects. Consciousness consequently appears differently modified according to the difference of the given object, and the gradual specification of consciousness appears as a variation in the characteristics of its objects. Ego The subject of consciousness is thinking. The logical process of modifying the object is what is identical in subject and object, their absolute interdependence, what makes the object the subject's own. The Kantian philosophy may be more accurately described as having viewed the mind as consciousness, and as containing the propositions only of a phenomenology, not a philosophy of mind. The ego Kant regards as reference to something away and beyond, which in its abstract description is termed the thing at itself. And it is only from this finite point of view that he treats both intellect and will. Though in the notion of a power of reflective judgment, he touches upon the idea of mind, a subject, objectivity, and intuitive intellect, and similar things. And even the idea of nature, still this idea is again deposed to an appearance, an essence, to a subjective maxim. See Encyclopedia section 58. Reinhold may therefore be said to have correctly appreciated Kantism or Kantism when he treated it as a theory of consciousness under the name of faculty of ideation. Fichte kept to the same point of view. His non ego is only something set over against the ego, only defined as in consciousness. It is made no more than an infinite shock, in essence, a thing in itself. Both systems, therefore, have clearly not reached the intelligible unity or the mind as it actually and essentially is, but only as it is in reference to something. As against Spinozism, again, it is to be noted that the mind, in the judgment by which it constitutes itself as ego, a free subject contrasted with its qualitative affection, has emerged from substance, and that the philosophy, which gives this judgment as the absolute characteristic of mind, has emerged from Spinozism. Encyclopedia 416. The aim of consciousness, the aim of conscious mind, is to make its appearance identical with its essence, to raise its self certainty to truth. The existence of mind in the stage of consciousness is finite, because it is merely a nominal self relation or mere certainty. The object is only abstractly characterized as its. In other words, in the object, it is only as an abstract ego that the mind is reflected into itself. Hence, its existence there has still a content, which is not as its own. Encyclopedia section 417. The grades of this elevation of certainty to truth are three in number. First, A. Consciousness in general with an object set against it. B. Self consciousness, for which ego is the object. C. Unity of consciousness and self consciousness, where the mind sees itself embodied in the object to and sees itself as implicitly and explicitly determinate, as reason, the notion of mind. Subsection A. Consciousness proper, das Bewusstsein, das Bewusstsein aus Sokes, das das Sinnetlike Bewusstsein. I will improve the pronunciation in the outline. Supersection Alpha, Sensuous Consciousness. Encyclopedia section 418. Consciousness is, first, immediate consciousness, and its reference to the object accordingly, the simple and underived certainty of it, the object similarly being immediate and existent reflected in itself, is further characterized as immediately singular. This is self-consciousness. Consciousness, as a case of correlation, comprises only the categories belonging to the abstract ego or formal thinking, and these it treats as features of the object. Encyclopedia, see Encyclopedia section 415. Since consciousness, therefore, is aware of the object as an existent, a something, an existing thing, a singular, and so on, it appears as wealthiest in matter, but as poorest in thought. That wealth of matter is made out of sensations. They are the material of consciousness. See Encyclopedia, section 414. The substantial and qualitative, what the soul in its anthropological sphere is and finds in itself. This material, the ego, the reflection of the soul in itself, separates from itself and puts it first under the category of being. Spatial and temporal singularness, here and now, the terms by which, in the Phenomenology of Mind, W2, page 73, I describe the object of sense consciousness, strictly belongs to intuition. At present, the object is at first to be viewed only in its correlation to consciousness, in essence, a something external to it, and not yet as external on its own part, or as being beside or out of itself. Encyclopedia section 419. The sensible as somewhat becomes an other. The reflection in itself of this somewhat, the thing, has many properties, and as a single thing, in its immediacy, has several predicates. The muchness of the sense singular thus becomes a breadth, a variety of relations, reflectional attributes, and universalities. These are logical terms introduced by the thinking principle, in essence, in this case by the ego, to describe the sensible. But the ego, as itself apparent, sees in all this characterization a change in the object and self-consciousness. So construing the object is self-perception. Supersection beta, sense perception. Wahrnehmung. Encyclopedia section 420. Consciousness, having passed beyond the sensibility, wants to take the oath in its truth, not as merely immediate, but as mediated, reflected in itself and universal. Such an object is a combination of sense qualities with attributes of wider range by which thought defines concrete relations and connections. Hence, the identity of consciousness with the object passes from the abstract identity of I am sure to the definite identity of I know and am aware. The particular grade of consciousness on which Kantism conceives the mind is perception, which is also the general point of view taken by ordinary consciousness, and more or less by the sciences. The sensuous certitudes of single appreciations or observations form the starting point. These are supposed to be elevated to truth by being regarded in their bearings, reflected upon, and on the lines of definite categories, turned at the same time into something necessary and universal. This is by viewing experiences. Encyclopedia section 421. This conjunction of individual and universal is admixture. The individual remains at the bottom, hard and unaffected by the universal, to which, however, it is related. It is therefore a tissue of contradictions. Between the single things of sense appreciation, between the single things of sense apperception, which form the alleged ground of general experience, and the universality which has a higher claim to be the essence and ground, between the individuality of a thing which, taken in its concrete content, constitutes its independence and the various properties which, free from this negative link and from one another, are independent universal matters. See Encyclopedia section 123. This contradiction of the finite which runs through all forms of the logical spheres turns out most concrete when the somewhat is defined as object. See Encyclopedia section 194 and the sequence. Supersection gamma, the intellect. Der Verstand. Encyclopedia section 422. The proximate truth of perception is that it is the object which is an appearance, and that the object's reflection in itself is, on the contrary, a self-subsistent inward and universal. The consciousness of such an object is intellect. This inward, as we called it, of the thing is on one hand the suppression of the multiplicity of the sensible, and in that manner an abstract identity. On the other hand, however, it also, for that reason, contains the multiplicity, but as an interior simple difference, which remains self identical in the vicissitudes of appearance. This simple difference is the realm of the laws of the phenomena, a copy of the phenomenon, but brought to rest in universality. Encyclopedia section 423. The law, at first stating the mutual dependence of universal, permanent terms, has, in so far as its distinction is the inward one, its necessity on its own part. The one of the terms, as not externally different from the other, lies immediately in the other. But in this manner, the interior distinction is what it is in truth. The distinction on its own part, or the distinction which is none. With this new form characteristic on the whole, consciousness implicitly vanishes. For consciousness, as such, implies the reciprocal independence of subject and object. The ego, in its judgment, has an object which is not distinct from it, it has itself. Consciousness has passed into self consciousness. Subsection B, self consciousness. Self, Selbstbewusstsein. Encyclopedia 424. Self consciousness is the truth of consciousness. The latter is a consequence of the former. All consciousness of an other object being as a matter of fact also self consciousness. The object is my idea. I am aware of the object as mine. and thus in it I am aware of me. The formula of self consciousness is I equals I in relation to abstract freedom, pure ideality. Insofar it lacks reality, for as it is its own object, there is strictly speaking no object, because there is no distinction between it and the object, no relativity. Subsection, Encyclopedia section 425. Abstract self consciousness is the first negation of consciousness, and for that reason it is burdened with an external object, or nominally with the negation of it. Thus, it is at the same time the antecedent stage, consciousness. It is the contradiction of itself as self consciousness and as consciousness. But the latter aspect of the negation in general is in I equals I potentially suppressed. And hence, as the certitude of self against the object, it is the impulse to realize its implicit nature by giving its abstract self awareness content and objectivity, and in the other direction to free itself from its sensuousness, to set aside the given objectivity and identify it with itself. The two processes are one and the same, the identification of its consciousness and self consciousness. Supersection alpha, appetite, or supersection alpha, appetite, or instinctive desire. Die Begierde. Encyclopedia section 426. Self consciousness, in its immediacy, is a singular and a desire appetite, the contradiction implied in its abstraction, which should yet be objective, or in its immediacy, which has the shape of an external object and should be subjective. The certitude of oneself, which issues from the suppression of mere consciousness, pronounces the object null, and the outlook of self consciousness toward the object equally qualifies the abstract ideality of self consciousness as null. Encyclopedia section 427. Self consciousness, therefore, knows itself implicit in the object, which in this outlook is comfortable to the appetite. In the negation of the two one sided moments by the ego's own activity, this identity comes to be for the ego. To this activity, the object, which implicitly and for self consciousness is selfless, can make no resistance. The dialectic implicit in it towards self suppression exists in this case as that activity of the ego. Thus, while the given object is rendered subjective, the subjectivity divests itself of its one sidedness and becomes objective to itself. Encyclopedia section 428. The product of this process is the fast conjunction of the ego with itself, its satisfaction realized, and itself made actual. On the external side, it continues, in this return upon itself, primarily describable as an individual, and maintains itself as such because its bearing upon the selfless object is purely negative, the latter therefore being merely consumed. Thus, appetite in its satisfaction is always destructive, and in its content selfish. And as the satisfaction has only happened in the individual, and that is transient, the appetite is again generated in the very act of satisfaction. Encyclopedia section 429. But on the inner side, or implicitly, the sense of self which the ego gets in the satisfaction does not remain in abstract self concentration or in mere individuality. On the contrary, as negation of immediacy and individuality, the result involves a character of universality and of the identity of self consciousness with its object. The subject of deremption of this self consciousness is the consciousness of a free object, in which ego is aware of itself as an ego, which, however, is also still outside it.